And Suzanne Schultz is considered a charismatic ball of energy with a reputation as one of the best planning directors in the nation. She is on a mission to build a community where people want to live and work. Her husband, Scott, says she, quote, she loves what she does and she loves Grand Rapids. I look around at the city differently because of her. She makes you think about how to keep the city looking great, not filled with big, hot, steamy parking lots. Her job is to make the city look wonderful, so people will want to come here and stay here. Suzanne grew up in East Bay in Traverse City. I think she was the oldest of 4 kids of Pat and Dennis LaBelle. She was a liberal arts major at Northwestern Michigan Community College, which is similar to what we are here. She discovered urban planning somewhere in the process and obtained her bachelor's degree at MSU. She talks excitedly about the stuff that makes most people's eyes glaze over, and I have the same problem when you're talking about zoning and building codes, and everybody goes, boom, blank stares. She and Scott got married in 1995, which is not so long ago, actually, but 13 years ago. 13 years, right? She moved to Grand Rapids in 1996 when Scott decided to go to culinary school here at GRCC. She was hired by the city of Grand Rapids initially as a planner, and she walked right into the first problem that she had to deal with, which was the city's master plan. And if anyone in my class knows, we've actually been talking about the city master plan recently. It's first updated the city master plan in 40 years. She was appointed as the director of planning in 2005, and she completed the zoning project last year. And in between all of those amazing tasks, she's managed to have 3 children. And I don't know how you can do it, but maybe it's somebody that not only can bring home the bacon, but can fry it up in the pan, I suppose, is the way to look at that. In between those amazing tasks, she has 3 children, Madeline, Jacob, and Chloe. She's married to Scott Schultz, and they have a deli, if that's not enough, down on Cherry Street. And her current project that she's working on is Grand Rapids Green, or is it Green Grand Rapids? Green Grand Rapids. I like to tell a story about her, and I think this is kind of indicative of how you see how current zoning laws and rules take in effect. When the representatives of Family Dollar chain wanted to put a store on Granville Avenue Southwest, it looked like all the other stores that they had, and Suzanne Schultz told them they couldn't. It had to be nicer. Grand Rapids planning director said it had to be snuggled up to the sidewalk, and it had to have a gaping parking lot tucked in the rear. A guy from the company flew here from Atlanta to change Schultz's mind. They couldn't do it, he insisted. And if you want to see what it looks like, you just need to drive over there. She's going to have some pictures of it. Anyway, I give you Suzanne Schultz.
Thanks, Ray. Mr. Hinkle mentioned that people think that zoning and planning can be pretty boring, but I think hopefully that after you see this presentation, you'll say, wow, there's a lot of things that influence, these zoning rules influence a lot of things in your daily life that you couldn't imagine. Everything from how buildings are placed to how high they are to what they're used for. And there's a number of different things that we affect in your everyday daily lives, including street design. I'm going to kind of cover the master plan, our pattern book, zoning ordinance, development projects in Grand Rapids. So you kind of get a whole huge slew of things presented to you today. But as Ray mentioned, when I came on as just as a planner one, when I started at the city had a master plan that was from 1963. And I had actually left consulting to join the city because I was about to have my first child, and I wanted to get away from night meetings. Well, ironically, 250 meetings later and 3,000 participants, we have a master plan. So there were a lot of meetings that ended up happening when I came on board. But really, we were talking to citizens about what's their vision of the future. And a master plan is a policy document that guides decision making in the community. And in our 1923, the city actually has 3 master plans, which is really interesting from kind of a historical perspective, because there are planning movements that really dictate the shape of the city, the shape of our development. The 1923 plan was based around streetcars and the City Beautiful movement. We have a Daniel Burnham plan, and that was the same plan that they used in Chicago. So all the museums and stuff that you see, the very ornate architecture, was during the City Beautiful movement. And the plan that they were recommending, very dense. You don't see any blank voids with parking lots, but a whole green space along the Grand River. And this idea that the urban core is very dense and very walkable. Then we had our 40 years later, 4 decades. We thought, let's do another master plan. So in 1963, we adopted a new plan, and it was based on urban renewal. And the whole premise of that plan was out with the old, in with the new. That all the old stuff is bad, and we need to reinvent the city. And we need to reinvent the city for automobiles. So in the 60s to the early 70s, we had the freeways come through downtown, 131 and 196, started to divide up the city. We had this type of architecture, which is very auto-oriented, very hard, for a pedestrian, if you're walking by, to really feel some sort of space, to feel some more sort of orientation to the built environment. So while it's very interesting to look at, it's not really friendly and not really for people. It's more for architects. So with our new master plan, we thought, well, it's been 40 years. Time to do a new one. We came out with, in 2002, we adopted a new master plan based on what some people would call new urbanist principles, or really what it is smart growth. There's a whole bunch of work that's been recently done with smart growth, and I'll cover those tenets in just a second. But the process that we used to engage citizens really was like a funnel. We had a number of meetings, about 100 meetings right at the front end. We went to every neighborhood and business association and asked them what they thought the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats were of their area. And based on that, we divided out the strengths and opportunities into values, things that they thought were important if they were to consider them strengths. And those weaknesses and threats we divided into issues. So things that we needed to work on. And then we went back to the community and said, okay, based on this, are there some value statements that we can create? Are there some goals that we can envision? And what are those themes that we're going to create as we go along? And we had opportunities for people to identify where they wanted to see change occur, what kind of change, what should things look like if we're going to have a new plan, a new development in the city. And so it ended up with a whole compilation at the end of a pretty intense master plan. But when we went through the entire process, citizens kept saying, we want a walkable community, we want mixed use, we want multimodal, we want transit and places for bicycles. We want a range of housing choices and opportunities. So it's not just all single family. We've got a variety of housing types at a variety of different price points for people to enter into the community. And even one neighborhood that I wouldn't have anticipated, for instance, the Boston, just along Boston by Metropolitan Hospital, where it used to be. That neighborhood's pretty much all single family. And when I went to the Eastgate Neighborhood Association, and we were asking what they like about their neighborhood, they said, we really like that little apartment building that we have down the street, which I was kind of surprised by because this is mostly a single family neighborhood, and I asked why. And they said, well, we like it because young couples move into the apartment because they can afford it. They like the neighborhood so much they buy in the neighborhood and raise their families. And then when they're too old or they want to take care of that house anymore, our senior citizens can move into the apartment and still stay in the neighborhood. And so we really like the idea of a life cycle neighborhood, that you can have entry-level housing, students or young families can move in, they can stay and they can grow old all in place and have the resources available and their friends and neighbors around them so they don't have to live in isolation. And the idea that we're building in compact design, that we're not trying to space things out, but we're really trying to join them together. I mentioned the walkable and accessible neighborhood, and that is a key thing for the success of transit, for the success of mixed use, that you have to have these things together in a way that makes sense and it works for somebody to walk, that you're comfortable. Because if you're driving every place, you're making places for cars. You have to find the parking. You have to, all that car storage that we don't like. And that by building the urban core, we're preserving farmland out in the suburbs because people aren't feeling like they have to leave and move out, that they want to come in and stay. We also had a premise that we wanted to make development decisions predictable and fair. So when we're going through the master plan, when we talked about institutions, it's like you've got to let those things grow. You have to allow development to happen, but how are you going to let that happen? And so the idea was being in the master plan, we're hearing what citizens want, and then when it transferred into the zoning ordinance, citizens participated in the creation of that document and what they want, so that by the end of the time we were done adopting the zoning ordinance, if the developers are following all the rules, they don't have to go to the planning commission. They don't have to follow a whole bureaucratic process. Staff can approve it by right. So if they're hitting the nail on the head, giving the community everything they wanted, they could just go forward and come in for their permit. There's 7 themes in the master plan. One's great neighborhoods. The great neighborhoods theme really focused on that life cycle neighborhood that I already mentioned. Variety of price points, variety of housing types. And I really think that that's what's going to make us different than the suburbs in the future. When you look at rising gas prices and who's going to succeed and who's going to fail, a lot of experts are saying those McMansions out in the townships on 2 acres aren't going to fare so well. They're not going to do real well because there's not a lot of people who, with less than a quarter of the population being mom and dad and 2 kids, who's going to buy those homes? So when we have a whole range of housing types, it allows for people to choose how, where they want to live, how they want to work. Vital business districts, that we need to have pedestrian-oriented business districts, and that they're mixed use, and that we have as much of a population base surrounding them and in them as possible to support those businesses and create activity on the street that adds to the vitality of the district. If you see people walking around, you feel more comfortable. If you see that activity, people are outside eating and dining and walking their dogs and pushing those strollers, that's a place where you want to be. And so we talked about the importance of facade transparency, having windows on the front of the stores. If you think about walking from Sears to JCPenney's at the shopping mall, and you're walking through there and there's lots of glass, and it's, the whole thing is glass as you walk down through the mall. Well, imagine half of the glass boarded up, or have curtains on it, or shades, or blinds. And all of a sudden, it's not such an interesting place to be. You have these dead spaces that are created when you start boxing up windows. And so we really hit hard the fact that you need to have window transparency, and that the buildings need to be placed on the street at that sidewalk, so that you're not walking by a parking lot, instead of you're walking by people who are eating, who you can storefront windows you can shop at. So it's much more interactive and exciting. A strong economy, that we have to allow a space for our institutions to grow. And it's a tough balance when you're trying to balance neighborhood concerns and some neighborhood preservation. For instance, Heritage Hill is a historic district, with the needs of institutional growth. And trying to maintain that balance and respect that as development happens, we're doing it in a sensitive manner. Balanced transportation, that we're not just creating community for cars, but that it's pedestrian-oriented and bicycle-friendly. And we have a number of different strategies to do that, and we're really hitting that especially hard now with Green Grand Rapids. But we worked cooperatively with the Rapid on their plan, and the Rapid has their routes identified. We used that information when we created our future land use map to show where we should have nodes of transit-oriented development, so where we should have the highest density development with mixed uses, and how those related to the transit, how they related to the buses. And what was really cool about that is the Rapid then was able to take our master plan and use it as one of the reasons why they needed to get federal funding for a bus rapid transit route. And they've been successful in obtaining that funding. The BRT is supposed to go from downtown down South Division to 60th Street and back, stopping every 10 minutes, and it doesn't look like that bus. It looks more like a light rail car, but it has rubber tires, and it has green light technology. So when the light is turning yellow at the stop signal, it holds the green for the bus to go through. And at the station, you can roll your bike or you can roll your wheelchair or your stroller right onto the bus, and you pay ahead of time. So you walk right on rather than having to stop and pay the meter or pay the fare when you get on the bus. So that's in the works. And the Rapid was able to point to our master plan saying they have a land use plan that is supportive of this kind of transit ridership. And so they've worked very closely together. A city that enriches our lives has to deal with quality of life. We wanted to make a place where people want to be. So Parks and Recreation Master Plan was updated the same time the master plan was. And we focused on what are those amenities that citizens want, those green spaces in particular, and how do they connect together to the Grand River. And the Grand River really became a focus of discussion during the master plan process and how to enhance it. We paid some attention to it when we did the master plan, but now with Green Grand Rapids we're hitting that even harder and really focusing on how do we really enhance the quality of life, because when you look at the knowledge workers that can choose wherever they want to live, this theme is the thing that will dictate where they want to live. The transit, all those mixed use pieces, they all work together, but it's more than that. It's kind of a value plus. And a city in balance with nature. As you know, Grand Rapids is very into sustainability, and how do we manage stormwater is a critical issue, especially when we're talking about development. So there's some recommendations on how to deal with stormwater management techniques, and then again focusing in on green roofs, LEED development in that theme. And then lastly, partnerships that, as I mentioned with the Rapid example, we all do it together, and that it's not just the city doing this, but it's developers working with us, the transit authority, the neighborhood associations, business associations, and that we're working towards common goals. So the future land use map I mentioned, when I talk about these nodes for the Rapid, this is division right here, we show these big red dots that show what these transit-oriented development nodes are supposed to look like. And the mixed-use commercial is the red in this area. This is downtown. And in our old master plan and zoning ordinance, all the locations along the river were formerly zoned industrial and shown as industrial use. And we've seen such a huge change. Over half of our land actually was just recently switched over with our new zoning ordinance from industrial to mixed use. Because when you have trends like the Berkey and Gay building, which is now Boardwalk, the whole west side over here, what Bob Israels has been doing, we're seeing a lot of these old warehouse factories. They're really not viable industrial spaces anymore. They're much more better suited to residential and commercial office type uses. So we've actually changed what used to be a pretty heavy industrial corridor into a mixed use zone. And we've left several areas remaining for industrial, but what we're seeing is that we've become more of an incubator space. We have some great spaces. Steelcase campus, for instance, down by 44th is getting redeveloped for industrial. But a lot of the older industrial areas are much harder to redevelop for those purposes. I mentioned those nodes, those red circles, and this is what small neighborhood scale would look like, village and sub-regional. The idea is that you're not doing linear commercial strip development like we used to do on 28th Street, but that you have nodes and connectors in between of different types of uses. So in the core, there's your central business district or your core business district. East Town is a great example of this, where it's just really, it's really compressed into one kind of section of the city. And then surrounding it, and then surrounding it, you have higher density residential uses, and residential uses are also on top. You might have office uses in between, transitioning out of that, but that you have these specific nodes. And the Uptown area is a really good example with Cherry Street, Wealthy Street, Fulton, and East Town. If you really think of what's in between them, it's only a couple blocks of residential. But imagine if those residential blocks were taken out and we put commercial in, it would dilute all of those little shopping areas that we like so much and have been so successful. So having that separation of commercial from the residential and blending these things is really important from an urban design standpoint. When we went through the master plan process, people talked about how well they liked their neighborhood. And they could be living on 28th Street or Heritage Hill, but they liked where they lived. They liked the convenience of where they lived. They liked their house. And so when we looked through that and said, well, okay, they like their house, they like where they live, they like the architecture, whatever it is. What does that mean if we're trying to implement the master plan? There has to be some connection between that. And when we think about the differences in the neighborhoods, they're pretty substantial. So what we did is we started mapping by development type. Whoops, go back. We started mapping by development type in the master plan, and said there's different eras of development that the city developed at, and maybe there's some logic at looking at those development types or those development areas to see if there's not some sort of pattern that we can get from that. So we started some discussion when we did the master plan, and then we started talking about the zoning ordinance. And the zoning ordinance was written when man landed on the moon and before I was born. So it was really old and really bad, and it had been amended over 300 times. So it was very broken and very auto-oriented. Residential development wasn't allowed in some of the downtown areas. Housing wasn't allowed above retail uses by right in any of our business districts. You had to go to the Planning Commission to get special permission. Parking numbers were, depending on the use, 5 spaces per 1,000 or 1 space per 200 square feet of area. So it was a difficult code to work with and difficult to make it work. And what we found is that people had to make frequent trips to the Board of Zoning Appeals. And the Board of Zoning Appeals is our quasi-judicial body at the city that they review. Their job is to uphold the ordinance, but they also have to recognize the existing built environment and what they have to, for a development project, take into consideration a number of factors. And the BZA was having 2 meetings a month with 10 items on every agenda. So that's a key that something's wrong. Right now that we have our new code, they meet once a month and about 4 items are on the agenda. So it's a huge difference. We looked at the district and the general overall philosophy of the master plan, and then we looked at the concepts that the master plan represented, and then we started to get down to details. The zoning ordinance is a legal document. It's the legislative portion of planning. It implements the master plan. So you have your policies in place. There are policies in the master plan. The zoning ordinance is what implements those policies. So to try to figure out what we wanted to quantify and what it meant when we talk about neighborhood character and those things that were important to citizens, we created a neighborhood pattern book to try to help us engage citizens in that discussion and to ask them, what is it that we had that discussion in the master plan about what they value, but really get down to those little details about the buildings and the homes that they thought were important to them. So we created the pattern book. And we mapped year of construction using our GIS system. We have our assessor's data that has year of construction for single-family homes or residential structures, and so we used that data to map, and we manipulated the data back and forth to try to find out where the most logical breaks seemed to be. And we ended up with 4 neighborhood types. The first one was the traditional neighborhood, or it was like pre-1900 neighborhood, the yellow, and then the blue was basically kind of the pre-World War II portion of the city. Green ended up being kind of 1960s to 1980s, and the purple is the more modern portion of the city. And then we also looked at streets and how the physical form of the city is comprised. And these are both 1 mile squares. And here you see the traditional neighborhood pattern with this really fine grid of streets, 200 to 300 feet per block, walking distance. And in that pattern, we'll get to the land use, but it's very walkable. Things are connected. You have many different routes that you can choose to go. The more modern pattern that we've been developing, and if you go into a lot of townships, you're starting to see off of the the section mile roads. They look like little worms if you look from the aerials. But there's nothing connected. You have one way in, one way out. You have huge streets that have to accommodate for all the traffic because there's one way in, one way out to all of these. So they all go onto these major collector streets and the traffic won't diffuse. And if you think about when the S-curve closed, in MDOT, everybody said, if you'll remember that, the helicopters were going to be flying from all the news stations, and there's going to be backups everywhere, and the world's coming to an end. it didn't happen. And everybody said, well, where did the traffic go? Well, when you have all these different ways to choose where to go, the street grid absorbed the traffic. And people found their way, they had alternate routes, and they figured it out. Imagine if the East Beltline went down. All the northern suburb, where are they going to go? So it's a completely different physical form, and the functions of the streets really are very, very different. Land use, this is the same 1 square mile. You'll notice this is, you have your whole grid system in here. The red is commercial. The yellow is single family. That tanner color is medium density, or it's more multifamily. Purple is institutional, I think, and then there's just some voids where we didn't have data. But this is our existing land use pattern in 2000. And so you see these quarter-mile walks that you have from Fulton to Cherry Street to Wealthy Street in the upper left-hand corner, that you can go from here to here, very comfortable walking distance and very transit-oriented. And then you've got that surrounding residential. In this area, the land uses are very, very segregated. You have your multifamily, they all live over here. Your single family, they all live over here. You got your commercial on the strip, and it kind of goes all the way up and down the road, and there's some office in between here. And they all come out onto one street. So completely different, not pedestrian-oriented. You can't walk it. You have to drive it. You have to get in your car to go someplace. Then we also looked at the physical form of the structures. How are they designed? So we looked at the traditional neighborhood, front porch, pitched roof, windows, very interactive. Then we have the more 60s style housing, 60s, 70s. Still, face of the house is up front. You got a garage, though, that's starting to creep up towards it. And the garage, isn't quite protruding from the front of the house. And then you have the more modern form where you have the garage sticking out in the front of the house, and you may or may not, you can maybe find the front door, and you might have a window on the side. So it's very different. And this type of house may be fine with all the other houses that look like it. But this type of house in this type of neighborhood, in the traditional neighborhood, doesn't fit. It completely creates a different environment. So when we talked to residents, they said, if it looks like this, it doesn't have to all look the same, and this doesn't have, in that neighborhood doesn't all have to look the same, but there should be some sort of balance. We should not have this all, this type of development introduced into this type of neighborhood doesn't work. And then we also looked at building setbacks. Where are the buildings situated on the lot? For the very old neighborhoods, this is on the Lower West Side, you've got maybe 5 to 10 feet from the sidewalk. And then in the post-war suburbs, you've got about 25 feet. And in the modern, you may be on a private road. You may or may not have sidewalks. And the setbacks vary between it. A lot of it depends on the natural features, because a lot of these areas were developed later because they weren't conducive to automatic straight platting like you see a lot of our streets. We also went through commercial development and looked at the building at the street with all the glass, recessed entries. We found that with talking with disability advocates that if you're sight impaired, it's much easier to find the front door to a building if you have a recessed entry. People know where it is. And the recessed entry also allows you to have that building at the sidewalk because your front door can open without hitting somebody in the face as they walk by. The post-war kind of neighborhood development had some parking in the front, but not a whole lot. But now we have these bigger, big box kind of developments, big strip malls with big parking lots in front. And so that's a whole different kind of form. And again, this is going to feel a little strange in the more modern neighborhood, and that's definitely going to feel quite odd in that kind of neighborhood. And then we started, as part of the building placement and building design questions, we said, well, if we take a typical street, let's say this is South Division, and talk about where the building should be placed. And if you take this lot right here, and you have the parking lot in the front and the building in the back, what kind of street edge does that create? Does it give you a sense of place? Does it give you a sense of enclosure? It doesn't do anything. But if you put the building up at the street, it starts to create a whole different sense of place. And all of a sudden, we actually use building placement for traffic calming, because all of a sudden you feel like you have to go slower because this is not this wide open space. So put the building at the street, and then add some streetscape and trees to, again, feel more enclosed, give a better sense of place. And then how you do your awnings and your signage and other amenities, on-street parking, pavement markings, all can contribute to that pedestrian orientation that you're looking for in the built environment. In November 5th of 2007, we adopted the new zoning code. We actually just this week repealed this code and adopted a whole brand spanking new code. But it's because we had so many little tweaks. A lot of this stuff has to do with calibration. What's the right fit for that neighborhood, for that typical development type, and make it right for Grand Rapids. We created the code ourselves, but once you start working with the code, we had so many new things that we had in there that we didn't have in the 1969 code. There were a lot of protections that weren't in the 1969 code that this now provides for our neighborhoods. A lot of it's trial and error and finding out what works and what works best with working with developers and neighborhoods. And so we had quite a few little adjustments, so much so that we just thought it was easier to pull it into new rather than confuse everybody with switching little words, or administratively it was a lot easier. So the key differences between the old code and the new code is in traditional zoning, Euclidean zoning they call it, based on the case Euclid versus Ambler, which is viewed as kind of the cornerstone of zoning. It primarily focused on use and segregating uses. And then how those uses happen and the operations of the physical form were covered. And then there might be some form requirements, some regulations having to do with what the building looks like, but it definitely was not equivalent to what the uses were. Our new code and typical form-based codes, although ours is kind of a hybrid between the traditional and the form-based, focuses on what the building looks like. So if I'm in an airplane and I look down, I can see where the buildings are placed, where they're situated in the lot, where the parking is located. But if I'm on the ground and I'm looking at that building, that's where you get into form. The building's popped up at the street and you're looking at it straight on. What are those key elements that really make it a place? So the regulations are broken into really 4 categories. We have uses. We list a whole bunch of uses, and we've gotten more restrictive in some ways on uses because of the whole mixed-use component. We have to be careful. You can't just throw commercial everything into a district with residential above and expect it to be a livable area. So a lot of it is a little bit more careful than what we may have had in the past. But we feel that to have a really truly vibrant mixed-use area, you have to make it someplace where people are comfortable living as well as working and playing. So it's a balancing act. Building site and placement, as I mentioned, is that plan view. You're looking down on the site. Building elements, you're popping it up, so you're looking at how tall it is. What's the articulation? Is there an expression line above the windows that kind of help lower the building? What kind of materials you're using? Where's the entry? And then all those fun accessory provisions such as signs and parking and landscaping and screening that we look at. Our new code is based on those tenets of smart growth that I already shared with you. LEED and D criteria, a lot of you may be familiar with leadership and energy and environmental design. The neighborhood development criteria, ND, is new. You'll see a lot of LEED certified buildings in town. There's NC for new construction, there's interiors, there's lots of different designations now that the Green Building Council has for LEED. ND is right now in its pilot stages, and when we looked at it, knowing that it was going to be coming online at some point in the future, we tried to figure out how to incorporate it as much as we could into the new zoning ordinance so that if a developer came in and was developing in the city, that the idea would be just by following the zoning ordinance, they would meet the base point criteria for basic certification for LEED ND. And so far it seems to be working pretty well. We actually have some developers who are trying to score their projects to see where they'd sit if they were to go for certification already. Transect, I'm not going to cover that too much, but if any of you have studied Andres Duany and New Urbanism, the idea that there's this whole continuum of basically human habitat, if you think of it that way, you've probably seen in biology class or environmental class that transect that goes from the sand dunes to the pine forest to the oak forest, and the idea is the same, that you have the most dense urban area in the core of your city, and then it transitions out into something a little bit less dense, but it's still very urban, and eventually you hit the country. So when you look at the tables for our list of uses and our dimensional requirements, you can see that transition going from the most dense in the downtown out to the more suburban portions of the city. We're not trying to change all the suburban portions of the city and convert them into something that's much more urban, because we recognize that our citizens want to have this whole range of choices, again, going back to different housing types. Crime prevention through environmental design is used by our police department, and the idea is that you're designing a community so that it's safe just by how you place things, the physical form that you create. Window transparency is a great example of this. If you look at a 7-Eleven, for instance, and you notice that there aren't a whole lot of, they don't plaster their windows with signs. You might see a couple posters, but you don't see all the windows covered with signs. What 7-Eleven found out was that their store clerks were safer and they had less crime happen in their stores if their clerks could see out and people who were outside could see in. And so the key is not to have windows that look like mirrors, not to have darkly tinted windows on the street, but to have things that are visible inside and out. And so we really hit that hard. And so people say, well, you just want windows to make it look pretty. Well, yeah, it looks pretty, but it's also for public safety reasons. And if you're in an urban environment, the perception that people have that you're not safe, really it starts to play into this idea of how do you design a community so people automatically feel safe, or you're creating an environment that deters crime just by how you design the building. And actually, if you look at crime stats, downtown Grand Rapids is more safe than a lot of shopping mall parking lots, because people are around, they're seen, and you talk to the police department and they'll tell you that the crime out in some of the more suburban shopping mall areas is a lot higher than what we get downtown. And then I already covered the master plan. What we did, couple little things. I'm not going to go through the zoning ordinance in incredible detail, but a couple different things that we did. In a lot of codes, you'll see separate articles for each zone district. We merged zone districts into two categories, residential and mixed use. Then we also have some special districts, for instance, industrial uses that should be kind of standalone all by themselves, and overlay districts, for instance, for floodplain, so that you don't have people building in the floodplain for obvious reasons. And then we added the parking and landscaping regulations, and then all of our administrative rules are at the bottom. The zoning ordinance is a little bit different than some other codes in that we put the definition sections at the bottom, in the back of it, so it's more like a glossary in some ways. We didn't put it up in the front. The general provisions portion of the code are kind of some general rules and guidelines. How do you measure things? Where are some general rules that apply to all different properties versus very specific rules? Non-conforming lots, buildings, uses, structures. The non-conforming section deals with buildings or structures that were there before this code, or uses that were there before this code that may not be legal now, but they have certain property rights to them. And then we go into the residential and the mixed-use sections. I mentioned the neighborhood districts before, and we've merged this neighborhood type, the yellow and the blue, together to form the traditional neighborhood. And really what it works out to be is it's pre-World War II. So really focused on development where it was pedestrian-oriented or streetcar driven. This is more the streetcar suburbs that we have in the blue. And then the green is really post-war neighborhood when cars started to really become the thing and you started to have the freeways. And then the purple is the more modern development. A lot of this is property that has been, I think all of it's been annexed into the city. So this is the much more modern portion of the city where we're seeing a couple new subdivisions here and there, not anymore, but a lot of the newer development in the city has been in those fringe areas. And we've broken the commercial and the residential zone districts into those three types. So traditional neighborhoods, anything built before World War II, they fall under this category. If you were built between the post-war, you're right here, and then modern kind of 80s and later, you're right here. And we have, for instance, a low-density residential district in all three of those, but they mean different things. The uses are the same, but the LDR in the traditional neighborhood says, for instance, when you get to physical form, you can't put a garage in the front of the house. Doesn't fit the neighborhood. You can put the garage in the back of the house. You can put it off the alley. You can hide your parking if you're a commercial building, put it behind the building, but the parking doesn't belong in the front. In the modern neighborhood, that's the way it was built. You're fine doing that. We don't have any problem with it. But we have to look at the kind of neighborhood that you're in. And one of the problems that we had was, for instance, commercial development or former C2 zone. When you looked at 28th Street had the same zoning as Cherry Street. So if a developer wanted to come into Cherry Street and clear the whole block and develop something like on 28th Street, they could have done that. We ended up in a challenge when we were dealing with Easttown, and when the pharmacy wanted to go in at Easttown at Lake Drive and Wealthy, and where they all intersect. And only because they wanted a drive-through was the Planning Commission able to save the building and keep the building up at the sidewalk. Otherwise, they would have been able to come in, level the building, put the building in the back of the lot, and keep the parking lot in front. I already mentioned the lead ND piece here, but again, it's a compilation between the Congress for the New Urbanism, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the U.S. Green Building Council. And then I'm going to give you some examples. I keep picking on Family Dollar today. But this is an example. This is Wealthy Street, and this was developed in the 80s, 90s with the parking in the front. You do have the window transparency, which is good. But this is the new example that Ray mentioned before on Granville. Pulled it to the front. They actually have apartments above, which is really nice. And so the property owner was very pleased with that. This is on Cherry Street, my window transparency. So you're no longer allowed to do this anymore. You have to do this and open that up. Landscaping, we require that you screen all parking lots now. Before, that was only required in the downtown and that was more of a recent development. In the past 10 years, we required landscaping in front of parking lots downtown. In the new code, you're required to landscape all of your parking lots to screen them. If there's existing conditions that are there now, we can't make them go back and change them. But when we have new development happen or they're tearing out the parking lot, then we can catch it and have that rule followed. Dumpster enclosures, never required anything with dumpster enclosures, including their placement next to residential. And now we have them, they're not all as pretty as this, but we did say you have to enclose your dumpster. So some of those little things that really start to create a quality community, quality environment, the sense that people care about what they're doing, have all been placed into the new ordinance. We also require pedestrian connections. Any new development that doesn't have a sidewalk is required to put a sidewalk in, and they're also required to have a lead from the sidewalk to the front door if you're a business. Doesn't matter where you're at in the city for that one. And then bicycle parking is also required for any new development. And it was funny because we're working with one retailer over on 28th Street, and we're going through the requirements, and I came to bike parking, and he said, "Bike parking? Why do I have to provide bike parking?" And his designer that was with him said, "Well, actually, I live in Eldra Heights, and I ride my bike to your store." So that was kind of fun, because it's like, well, guess what? It happens. And then we also have had a lot of new housing development and retail development happen recently. And while we were working on the new zoning ordinance, we had kind of a Band-Aid district called the Planned Redevelopment District. So a lot of these projects came in under the PRD, and then we used the same rules after we were able to test some of the PRD rules and put them into the new code. So these development projects are reflective of the kind of development that we're going to have for future projects. And this is Newberry Place Co-Housing. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is up in the Belknap neighborhood, which is just on the other side of Michigan Street over the freeway, kind of overlooking. And 20 units to the acre, and they're kind of townhouses. There's families who live and own their own units. Midtown Village. Initially, the developer came in and had proposed, not the current developer, but a former developer had come in and proposed boxes, office buildings that looked like they had just landed someplace on the site. And the neighborhood and the Planning Commission said, no way, you need to create something that provides some context, as a sense of place. And the architects were really great to work with us on this. So you start to create and frame places. There's actually green space on the other side of that. This is Wealthy and Diamond, and again, you have the storefronts, 2 levels of retail, or retail with 2 levels of residential above, and then behind it you have the parking. This is a live-work unit where below they have retail development, or they can use it for retail or office space, and then they live above. It's 2 units. And then Hope Lodge is another example. And the way we measure when development happens, we measure from the back of the curb. So we look at the property line and how that relates, but we try to get things to line up along what the established setback is or along where the curb line sits. And right at Cherry and Jefferson, this is where our first urban roundabout has been placed, if any of you have driven through it. And we're going to have a much bigger roundabout very shortly at Wealthy and Jefferson. That's going to be a 2-lane roundabout, and then we'll also have one at Wealthy and Lafayette. So all the construction that you see happening on Wealthy Street, completely different street than it was before we started our sewer project. So it's going to be really fun to see how that works. Green Grand Rapids has been our latest planning project, and with Green Grand Rapids, we had gone through we started the master plan, their first master plan in 2000, and that lasted till 2002. Then we picked up the zoning ordinance and tried to kind of revamp that to really fit what kind of community we wanted to be, with the pattern book in between. And with the adoption of that, it's not like I was looking for something to do, but state law requires that every 5 years we review our master plan. And there's been so many things that have gone on in the community that we really felt that a broader community discussion needed to happen, and it happened soon. I mean, we've been working on sustainability, there's rising gas prices, there's these other things that have been concerned, but the city budgets, as everybody knows, is not in great shape. And we've had significant cuts. For instance, our Parks Department's been cut by over 1/3 in their budget, which has significant implications. Our pools, we've been relying on private philanthropy to fund and keep our pools open during the summer, and that's been a challenge. As GRPS has been consolidating their facilities, we have historically counted GRPS land in our Parks and Recreation inventory, and that goes back to what was at that time kind of a revolutionary idea that we share facilities back in the 60s. So we had park school arrangements, and we still have the park school agreements, but we've always counted the schools as part of our park system when we calculate our acreages out. And a lot of communities do not do that. They'll have separate numbers. Well, as GRPS has been right-sizing their organization, they've been closing buildings and facilities and selling them off, and we have not, even though we have first right of refusal as a city, we've not been able to pick them up because of the budget woes. So we're losing green space in a lot of our core urban neighborhoods because of this kind of happening. So that's been a concern. We also have a declining amount of vacant developable land. The city used to, way back when, there was this story about the city used to sell lots for $1 if you wanted to build a house. And those days are long gone. We don't have any buildable lots left in our inventory, so to speak. And we see now a lot of the private nonprofit or just the nonprofit developers, for instance, ICCF or Habitat, who used to come to the city to get their lots for new houses. They've now had to go into the private market to find those lots because we just don't have any left. And so we start to see these changes, and the low-hanging fruit is getting more sparse for not only the residential but the commercial developers, and they're starting to now talk about, well, how do we acquire certain buildings to do demolition and reconstruction rather than just, I'm going to fill in something on this vacant piece of land. I mentioned the rising fuel prices and alternate modes, that people are really a lot more aware now than they were even 5 years ago about the pressures to be more environmentally friendly, to try to, you feel that pinch in your pocketbook, you want to get on your bike. The mayor also had a Blue Ribbon Commission on Parks and Recreation, and they had a number of funding recommendations and strategies. They looked at the funding situation, especially when we're talking about pools or other things in the cuts, and they came out with some recommendations. And then the quality of life. I mentioned the millennials and others who want to choose. They can choose wherever they want to live. They'll move there. I have friends who've moved to Chicago, and then they say, oh, I'll find my job later. And that's happening more and more. And as we continue to grow, and you've got these great medical institutions happening on Michigan Hill and at St. Mary's, as those things happen, they're trying to recruit people to come and live in Grand Rapids. Well, when they're comparing us to Chicago or us to Seattle or Portland or Austin or these other communities and saying, well, what do you have? And I'm choosing where I want to live based on what you got. Well, it's not just, well, we've got nice streets and we snowplow. It's, it's something else. So what is it that's going to make people want to be here? and get excited. So we came up with 6 core topics to look at for Green Grand Rapids. The first is parks, obviously, parks, playgrounds, cemeteries, natural areas, and open space. Our Parks Department is also responsible for the city cemeteries. And the cemeteries actually cause about a $500,000 deficit for the city every year. So they're definitely a challenge for us. Greening, the emerald ash borer has been an issue. This little bug is taking out all the ash trees, and we've got some great canopy trees because of the ash trees in a lot of our neighborhoods. And as we're losing those, and citizens are becoming more concerned, this is becoming more of a priority issue. As well as, again, the whole sustainability initiatives and global warming. How do you cool those parking lots? Well, you can do it with landscaping and trees. And property values, trees add a lot to property value. So how do we green up the city? Natural systems, looking at the floodplains, alternative energy options. How do we improve our water quality? We're almost done with our storm sewer and sanitary sewer separations, but there's still a lot more to do. And part of that's community education and working with WEMEAC. But there's still stormwater management in the future is going to get more tough. Our zoning requirements the stormwater requirements require that you retain all of your stormwater on site, or you have to pre-treat it before we allow you to release it. As you build more urban, that gets more challenging. You can do green roofs to help with that, or you bury you bury a stormwater cistern underneath your project. But how do you manage that stormwater on your site if you're putting as much of a building as you can on the property? Makes it more and more of a challenge. Connections, bike lanes are a big issue in the city. If I had to say that one of the number one issues that we're hearing about is about bikes. What's the city doing about that? And actually I have a whole other presentation, which I won't share with you tonight, all about bike lanes, because we've actually been doing quite a bit and nobody knows it. But when you look at it and you say, that makes some sense. But we've been doing shared use roads. That's what the white lines on the side. So if you drive up North Monroe, you'll see the white lines. Those are for shared roads. We just don't have the pavement markings down or the signs up, but that's what they're there for. And the new section of Monroe between Leonard and Ann, we're building 5-foot bike lanes. So you'll see that more, and the City Commission is very, very interested in that and having that discussion. And we've been asking people what are their priority routes for bike lanes, where should they go, and how should they be designed. And it really is at the policy level some decision making that has to be done. For instance, a lot of citizens may say, well, I like my on-street parking in front of my house. Well, if you're looking at a continuous network of bike lanes, that one block may have to lose their on-street parking for the benefit of having a continuous bike network. So there's some trade-offs that may have to happen. We don't have very big streets, and there's only so much right-of-way. And when you're trying to fit in travel lanes, parkway for your trees, your sidewalk for your pedestrians, and parking, it really becomes a tight arrangement, and you have to be very creative in how you design the street, how you make it so you can still move traffic, but you're accommodating other users as well. The Grand River has been a huge focus. A lot of people have been complaining, let's liven up the riverfront, let's make it an exciting place to be. And so we're really focusing on riverbank restoration. How do we connect the Riverwalk further south? How do we eventually connect downtown to Millennium Park? And that's part of the analysis and discussion that we're going through as part of this process. And then community gardens and farmers markets, the whole local food. A lot of it has to do with people wanting to be more healthy, but also with gas prices. People don't want to travel as far, and the whole buy local movement. So we've had a lot of interest in that. We have several project goals. We're trying to figure out how to use the resources that we have, which is not necessarily easy. How do we partner? How do we look at all the things, really take a step back and evaluate all of the things that we do and the processes that we have. Listen to the community, learn from the community, be creative about our problems, because we really want to make this process an action plan. We really want to have achievable goals. It's not just, something that's pretty intangible that people can't make sense of. So we're trying to really create something that's implementable, realistic, and also financially responsible, which are all kind of lofty goals, hard to do. We just finished the first phase of the process. We collected inventory and ideas. We've been in a huge data collection phase. We've partnered with Grand Valley State University, their Community Research Institute, and they have a lot of statistical census data that we're now combining with our parks inventory to look at who's being served, where do we have deficiencies. We interviewed a number of different organizations. We created a game called Green Pursuits, and asked people to map where they wanted it and where they wanted to have things, and asked them a number of questions. And then we had our first community forum in June where we had over 200 people participate. And the inventory map, I'll just flip through these really quick, but it shows, for instance, where the parks are, and then we also did a barrier analysis with our design team. The city has a group of multidisciplinary group of planning, traffic safety, fire, engineering, street lighting. We all sit down together every week and talk about what streets we need to have designed, if there's a project that needs to be looked at, so that we're providing a whole comprehensive review of that project in one place at one time, and we learn from each other. And one thing we did is we sat down and talked about where are some of these barriers that we could have these parks and do this walking radius around a park, but if you've got to cross a railroad track and go through an industrial area, you're probably not going to go play in the swing set, a quarter mile from your house. So we did a barriers analysis and looked at where those areas are to try to decide what impediments there might be for people to access green space. I mentioned Green Pursuits, and that was a big hit. We had over 120 boxes go out that citizens participated in, and they covered all the topics that I already mentioned. We covered some with finances and public policy. Those were a little bit harder, I think, for people to understand, but what we've done since is we've working the finance and the public policy piece into all of our discussions. And then citizens told us what they would like to see on the Grand River, what priority streets should be greened, what priority trails and bike lanes should happen. And we also looked at it as part of our inventory natural systems, and we're looking at hubs and connectors and how all of these things overlay. If I've got a bike path I want to create, how does that tie the natural system together for a wildlife corridor, which meets our environmental goals? How does that meet the multimodal goals that we have? Can we do it with porous pavement? So, we're dealing with the stormwater issue. So we're starting to overlay all of these pieces on top of one another to get a feel for what it looks like. And then we're adding data and, again, using the GIS system for walking radiuses, walking radii, looking at the population. Where are the densest portions of the city? Where's the highest concentrations of people that need to access green space? We're looking at the breakdown for population, so if it's children, versus seniors versus young adults that can drive. And tomorrow, we have Parking Day. I don't know if some of you have heard about it, downtown. But Parking Day should be really fun. It's where we're going to have about 20 groups take over parking spaces and turn them into green spaces. And they paid for their own space, so we had sod donated. They had an intern organizing the whole thing. So with Parking Day, it's going to be kind of fun. We have some design professionals from Miller's participating. Tommy Allen has been key in getting this organized, so we're very grateful to him. And so we're very excited. Tomorrow should be a lot of fun. And then later in October, we're going to have our second community forum, which you're all invited to participate in. Our second green gathering, and we're calling it Choices. The first one was ideas, getting ideas about people, what they wanted where and what they wanted to see. And this time it's adding that little dose of realism about, what's the priorities? What do we have? If we have to choose among these three things, what's the most important to you? And so that's going to start forming our action plan that we're asking citizens to participate in. And we have a website, which we're working on updating right now. But we're creating a new website. The website, when you go to it in about a month, will have all those maps I discussed on it. We'll have inventory maps, and then we'll also have some interactive things. You can post pictures, and we're trying to hook up a forum to it. So a lot more information will be available in about a month. And that's my presentation.
If anybody would like to have a question for Suzanne,
Suzanne, I applaud all that's happened. I used to be a city planner about 30 years ago in Indianapolis, and it was always land use, land use, land use, and every now and then we got into parks, but not that. My question concerns, I live in Grand Rapids Township, so I see all this stuff happening around me, but when the bike path gets to Grand Rapids Township, it stops dead because the township hasn't been involved with the planning process, at least it seems. So I guess my question is, this is great, this is exciting, this is wonderful. How are the neighboring communities, those ones in white where everything stops, getting involved with this also? Because you're leaping ahead, but there may be many townships or cities around that are sort of back in the 60s. And so what can we do, or what can be done to sort of get them on the wagon, I guess?
The Grand Valley Metro Council, which is kind of they don't have any power from a governance standpoint, but they have served the function of trying to get multiple jurisdictions to talk to one another. And the Metro Council basically comprises all of Kent County and a small portion of Ottawa County. They've been doing the non-motorized plan. They have a whole plan that shows where the bike lanes connect across those jurisdictional boundaries. There's been a whole initiative to focus in on that, especially there's a whole Rails to Trails initiative for 2010 where we're trying to get earmarks to fund a lot of these improvements. But the Metro Council has been having those land use discussions with jurisdictions. They actually were key to creating the East Beltline overlay between Grand Rapids Township, City of Grand Rapids, and Plainfield Township along the East Beltline corridor about where buildings should be placed, what they should look like, parking spaces and so on, landscaping requirements along the corridor for the East Beltline. Multi-jurisdictional stuff is difficult, and Michigan actually is pretty bad at it as a whole. A lot of it has to do with local control, and people don't want to share power. I'm not saying that it happens around here necessarily, but you see it in Detroit, you see it in a lot of places. Other communities, especially out west, they have a county system that they control the land use and everything else. It's not these little teeny pieces. Townships are 6 by 6 miles square. So they don't have those kind of systems in other portions of the country. There have been some communities where they've done away with the smaller jurisdictions in Ohio and so on, where they've just said, we're going to be stronger as a region than individually, and they kind of break down those barriers. I don't know how close we are to that, but the Metro Council has been working very hard to try to keep those conversations going and to look at, how we cross those boundaries. And we, as budget times get tighter, we're trying to share more services. So I think we're getting there. But the Metro Council did do a study. I mentioned the Transect, and they did an analysis of the Transect for the Grand Rapids region. I think it's on their website. They won an award for it. I'd look there. Or Andy Bowman can be contacted at the Metro Council too. So, yep. Yeah, the Metro Council's really become the location for some of that interaction, especially among city managers and mayors. Yep.
Anyone else have a question for Suzanne? Well, I have one here. Just a second, Dave. Hold on. I think this whole business about living in a community is, is certainly important. And this, I live in East Grand Rapids, which carves a big chunk right out of the center section of the city of Grand Rapids, but it is also one of the oldest communities in the state as well. It was built, I think, originally formed back in 1923. The point I would raise is I made a phone call last year or last semester when you came over and did this before, and I talked to the planner at the East Grand Rapids, and I mentioned the change of zoning conditions occurring in the city of Grand Rapids, and at the time his whole demeanor went, "Oh, really?" But you have so much land area that is shared with East Grand Rapids, and it does have recreational resources in East Grand Rapids. How do you deal with a community like that, which in fact has gone through a major change in its own downtown perception and have done some major design issues there?
I think a lot of it has to do with dialogue. I mentioned the bike lane example before. The Fry Foundation actually just recently funded a study to look at how the bike path around Reed's Lake connects to Millennium Park, and how do you get through the city to do that. So we worked with East Grand Rapids on that. And we've got some proposed alignments, and it does involve taking off some on-street parking if that happens, so then we get into the bigger city commission policy discussions. But Brian Donovan and we have a good working relationship. If there's issues that come up, I think we feel free to email or call if there's any concerns. It's always a challenge when Grand Rapids is 97% built out. For all intents and purposes, East Grand Rapids is 100% built out. So a lot of it's tending the garden in a lot of ways. And when we have opportunities for development and to learn from another, we try to do that, I think, as much as possible. Again, the Metro Council, once in a while, we get together as planners and have a lunch meeting and do a presentation. And not too long ago, I did a presentation about the zoning code to local planners so that they could see what we were up to. And in some ways it's been a challenge because I haven't wanted to go out too much to other communities. Grand Rapids is kind of the 500-pound gorilla in the region, so you don't want to feel like you're stepping on toes. And it's also I wasn't comfortable until we sort of had our house in order from a planning and zoning standpoint. Have the zoning tested for a while, show how the master plan can work, and I think that creates a much more compelling discussion. And when you've got live examples to show people and to show how it works, I think that really gives people comfort and builds an understanding that you can't really convey in words. So it's kind of this chicken and egg, I think, piece to it.
Dave?
Well, I can ask one other question. There was a big discussion about that golf course on the corner of Kalamazoo and 28th Street, the Indian Hills Golf Course.
Indian Trails Golf Course. And they were, it was a big brouhaha about they were going to sell the golf course to a developer. Could that happen? In the case of Indian Trails, it would take a vote of the people.
Good.
Because it's cemetery land, and according to our charter for the city, we cannot sell cemetery land without a vote. And we did test the waters. When we started Green Grand Rapids, one of our thoughts going into the process was, well, do we have land to sell to make money? Is that out there? Is that going to be received by the public? Is it worthy of discussion because of the Indian Trails? And that was really one of the impetuses for this whole process. And when we started going out and asking focus groups and having some of that discussion, it seemed to fall off the plate, kind of as it doesn't. How much sense does it make if we're already 25 to 50% short of what national standards are for green space, and we need to have a vote? And what we heard from the public when that was first announced and that discussion started was, that absolutely should not happen.
Oh, good.
I think it always can resurface. But there was that instance. There was Garfield Park. There was a whole discussion about Garfield Park and the Kroc Center and whether or not the Salvation Army should put the Kroc Center there for recreation programming. And so I think people really had a heightened awareness of what they could stand to lose if they weren't involved in the process. So I'm not saying it's totally going away. It may not go away, but right now I don't see it really as being a discussion on the table. When we get to the next phase of Green Grand Rapids and we really talk about how do we do some of these things, citizens may tell us something different. I'm not sure what we'll hear.
Thank you, David. That's Mr. David Dye, who is the former chairman of our department and is a registered architect for our department as well. David is in the process of finishing out his second semester of a sabbatical, which he's working on LEED certification for himself. And in that process, we've been involved with some of the development through Habitat for Humanity by buying some property was developed on some land up on the northeast side here, just north of the expressway, up near the Grand Rapids Public School bus garage area. Any other questions?
I think there was a guy in the back.
Somebody have a question over here?
I did, and it had to do with certain...
Hold on, Mr. Urban.
I can project. I don't need that. Oh, you need it for projection? Sorry about that. Specifically areas around schools. Now, I don't have any children, but I'm probably going to have some in the near future. But the bottom line is, I come from a controlling environment. I was 20 years in the service and spent the time looking at how we handled it in the service. I come out into the greater community in the civilian side, and I see what I perceive to be sometimes a lack of control of the traffic in the areas. I'll give you an example that I'm very familiar with is on the northeast side, where is now City and Middle High School. Mm-hmm. They have a blinking light at Sweet Street and Fuller. It used to be at one time, I guess that was going to be a through street. Mm-hmm. But right now you have lots of traffic coming in and out of there. You have many times where you have cops sitting on the corner trying to do a scare down, if you will. But the reason why I don't see a light there is because, quote, there haven't been enough accidents. One injury to a kid is much too much as far as I'm concerned. But that light, if it was turned into a green-red light, would make the entry-exit from that school a whole lot easier and a lot less difficult. Because, like I said, the first injury to a kid is much too much. What's the plans involved in that type of thing for the overall?
Well, in that particular circumstance, I'll address that first, and then, it ties to the other one. We used to meet every month with David Smith before he passed from Grand Rapids Public Schools to talk about those very issues. And actually, we did talk about that particular situation. The GRPS has recently hired their new facilities manager, and I just actually today talked to Lisa Freiberger about the need to start our meetings up again. Yeah, so we used to meet on a regular basis to talk about public safety issues, and that was planning with traffic safety, GRPS. Sometimes we bring the engineers in. So we have that dialogue going, and now that school is ramped up, we usually try to always meet at least once a month to make sure that there aren't any serious issues, and make sure that the crossings are in the right places and that people are going where they need to. And traffic circulation around schools is definitely tricky. By Fountain and Lion, that one's always a fun one, and backing up. And now that we've got the Montessori program there, the parents drive the kids, and so that one's tricky as well. And we were recently talking to them about how do you create, maybe there's a different circulation pattern we need on that entire block for the kids. So we do have that dialogue going with GRPS. It stalled for a while for reasons, unfortunate reasons. But we did actually talk about Sweet Street. So.
Follow-up to that is we have one downtown, a pedestrian crosswalk. Pedestrians in it, they own the crosswalk.
Right.
Who does that? Are we looking at that possibility?
Mid-block crossings are not very desirable from a safety standpoint. You want people to try to cross at intersections as much as possible. There is, I think, a whole community education, though, that needs to go around what rights do pedestrians have and cyclists have, to educate the motoring public about, my dream is to be like in Ann Arbor where you can just cross you cross anywhere and not really have to worry too much about looking, because all the cars are trained to stop when they see somebody even stick their foot out. So, if we could get people to understand that pedestrians always have the right of way, especially if in their crosswalk, you got to stop. And cyclists, it's a two-way street for cyclists. They need to learn the rules of the road, and people need to learn that they can be in the road. So that's, I think, a whole nother measure that needs to happen, and we've actually brought that up, especially when the roundabouts are going in now, because pedestrians do have the right of way, and training vehicles who have yields to stop for the pedestrians will be another component that we need to focus in on.
Okay, we have a question.
Thank you for the presentation. I live on the traditional west side, and I purchased the house from my aunt in 2003, so I also have my life experience visiting my aunt and my cousins, watching the neighborhood progress and whatnot. What does the city think about in the near future with the deterioration factors? The house is getting so old, the foundation's moving around. Just is there any plans to help the residents green up themselves? For example, when I moved in 2003, my water bill was roughly $60 a quarter. Now it's over $200. My electric bill was around 100, and now it's almost 300. As residents, we're trying to green up, but at the same time, it's hard to catch up with such a deteriorating neighborhood. How can the city help us with that, if possible?
The city does have a housing rehab program. I'm not that familiar with it, but that's in our community development department, that they do have opportunities for low interest loans. I don't believe they have a grant program. I think it depends on where you hit on the financial scale. But they do have a housing rehab program for homeowners to help them, and I think that's available on the website. As far as neighborhood deterioration in general, I think we are going to see, I think that the biggest challenge, if I have to look 10 years out, where we're going to see some of the most contentious issues happening, or the biggest, issues that we have to deal with as a community, is the fact that we don't have that much buildable land left. And so there will be redevelopment happening, and the challenge is going to be finding the right locations for that to occur. Leveling neighborhoods for the sake of, wholesale new development, I think we heard in the master plan, I believe, that that's not necessarily the way to go. But if we have substandard housing that isn't really doing anyone any good, it's not energy efficient, it's the basement leaks and there's structural issues, looking for those opportunities to allow new structures to go in a way that, again, fits the neighborhood, I think will be important for us. One of the challenges when you look at redevelopment is making the numbers work, and that's also going to be an issue. Usually what we're hearing from developers is, I'd love to redevelop this block, but I'm going to need more density to be able to make the numbers work. I need more housing units in this location to make it work so that, everything can happen. And that's, it's going to be this balance of getting the design right, the physical form of the new structures correct, so it doesn't feel like you're adding a whole lot of more density to the neighborhood, you're not adding a whole lot of new structures, but yet you're still able to build some of those in so that the numbers work, so that you get better housing. And when I say better housing, it doesn't mean that it's not for different price points. And density allows you to hit different price points much better than just tearing down a single family home to make a single family home. That price is going to be much higher than if you built 3 units, for instance, on that same lot. Then you can start to break out, what the payments would be, or you can reduce the cost, the overall cost of the project to that particular dwelling unit. So it's going to be kind of a balancing act, I think. And the Lower West Side even has a development project proposed right now that's going to be going in front of the City Commission along Seward, where a developer is asking you to take down 5 or 6 structures to put in multifamily housing. And there's neighbors who are opposed to that, and it's a challenge trying to figure out, especially along the edges, what do you do? And in some of those neighborhoods where the housing is challenged, to look at redevelopment opportunities.
Thank you, Suzanne. Are there any other questions? I noticed one thing that has come about in terms of discussion in our classes, perhaps, is that the infrastructure development, which is one of the intents and goals of the zoning ordinances, in fact, is infrastructure development. I noticed, for example, that down on Wealthy Street, and when you showed the picture of the development on Diamond and Wealthy, I believe, I can't remember the name of the building right now, but I know there's a name on it. But what I noticed first off was the power lines and the above head, which doesn't lead to a lot of attractive development process. What's your position on things of that sort, and how does the city tend to want to deal with those kinds of issues?
I would love to bury all the power lines. Everybody would love to bury the power lines. East Grand Rapids buried their power lines when they did the downtown streetscape. There was a recent court decision. I think it was, I want to say Farmington Hills or Novi. It was over on the southeast side of the state. Just recently, about who should pay for that, because it's very, very expensive to do, to lay the conduit underground, to have the wiring adjusted, everything. And unfortunately, the municipality lost, and they found in favor of consumers. So Consumers Energy they're protected under state law as a utility, and we try to bury as much as we can. When we do streetlight projects, we try to bury the conduit for the streetlights so they're not up, but they're underground. And we've been trying to provide that conduit as much as we can to get those lines off. And it affects everything from street trees, to the appearance, the general aesthetic appearance of the neighborhood. But there's not, unfortunately, for us to really push it, it would be very, very expensive for the city. The Downtown Development Authority has funded the bearing of the street or of the power lines in the downtown to give it a clean aesthetic. But we've not been able to do that in the rest of the city.
Are there any other questions? I have one more for myself, but I wanted to see if there's anybody else that has anything else. The only other question I have was relative to how form-based zoning that's being used within the city. You talk about your relationships with other communities around. It seems to me that the pattern of zoning that you're talking about, although relatively it's not going to change dramatically the neighborhoods that are coinciding or side by side with jurisdictional differences, but how is that going to map out the future? And it seems to me that some of these other jurisdictions are going to have to start thinking about form, and I believe they are thinking about form rather than use anyway, more in terms of that. How does it look? But also looking at how the use of the property and how it's being developed is important for them as well. So how do you see those things coming about in the future?
I think there's a number of different communities are at different levels of that in the region. City of Hudsonville is going to be redoing their zoning ordinance. We've already heard from them that they'd be interested in looking at what we've done in our experience. I think it's a lot easier to lift something that somebody else has used successfully and replicate it someplace else. And I have no pride of ownership with this stuff. We actually were very, very lucky to receive funding from the Phi Foundation and the Grand Rapids Community Foundation when we did the zoning ordinance. They helped fund the citizen participation efforts involved with writing the code. So I view my role and our responsibility as a city in that ordinance is to help others then kind of come along with what the latest trends are in writing ordinances and designing their cities. So Hudsonville has been very interested. We have other communities, for instance, Ketwood in Wyoming are talking about what to do with division, knowing that BRT route will be eventually going down there, and we've certainly offered up. We've got transit-oriented development already in our zoning ordinance, and feel free to use it. So it's that dialogue, and I think the relationships with the other planners and the land use attorneys in the region to kind of spread the word. Again, I think our role is trying to lead by example. We don't have any power to the other ones, and I don't want to feel like I'm stepping on toes and upsetting anyone, but if we can provide good examples and be a resource for those communities, we certainly are here to do that.
Thank you, Suzanne, for your presentation.